All right. I think we are ready to do this. Let's kick it off. We are right on time to the decimal, just how we like it. Atikan Wealth Partners Roundtable discussion, where we field any questions from clients, friends, family, and we review them and we talk about current economic events and other interesting stuff. So, uh, just so everybody knows, Colin Weimer on here just averaged up his value because he got married over the weekend. So, golf clap, round of applause. It was an amazing wedding. And we did dance despite his bride not wanting everybody to dance. I would say if you don't want people to dance, do not play music and have an open floor where people can dance. That, you know. So, Colin, congratulations, buddy. And just for that, I looked up some interesting data, which was the cost of a wedding. So spread across the United States, this is complimentary of the Visual Capitalist. I thought it was some interesting information. Average wedding cost by state. The cheapest is Utah, which I find to be pretty interesting. Um, and the most expensive is New Jersey. So Utah coming in at $17,000, and the most expensive being New Jersey, which beat New York and California, which is kind of crazy to me. I guess it makes a little bit of sense. Um, and then the amounts exclude the engagement ring, which typically costs over $5,000. Colin, I'm telling Emma that you bid under the average. So, Colin, words of wisdom, buddy.
Oh, dude. Well, first off, thanks for making the trip out here. Hope it was worth it. Um, Words of wisdom. Nobody's gonna like this answer, but I got to be honest. Emma and I both woke up on Sunday, and we were scared to tell the other person that we could have done without the party. We we could have just we could have just had the reception. The ceremony was beautiful. I loved the ceremony. Um, but it turned into exactly what Emma and I didn't want, which is like, strobe lights at the end of the night, everyone dancing, most people having probably too many drinks, etc. So no, in all seriousness, it was awesome. I got to marry my best friend. We are super pumped to be married, but the costs of this is pretty sobering. We're Yeah, yeah, it's a one-day big party for everyone else, to come in and celebrate, and yeah, these are pretty wild expenditures that we're looking at.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look at the data here, and number one, I thought I was your best friend, but I guess I just
Oh, well,
um,
yeah, well, we all have to swallow some hard truths every once in a while.
yeah,
Yes.
the jagged little pill I had to take there. Um, So, the span of wedding costs here is pretty interesting, and the reason I'm going into this as well is because, a lot of our clients, will often be e even if they've long been married, they're now almost feel obligated to pay for their kids or their grandkids' weddings, and so on, and you can kinda see the large span. I mean, yeah, and to your point, Colin, you're talking about 1 day's worth of event, and, out here in California, the average cost is $41,000. And we all know that that cost could go well beyond the average. And then on the other side, you have New York at $49,000. I mean, it's just wild. In New Jersey, like we said, 55K. So Colin, we're not gonna force you to tell us how much you spent on your wedding. But it was a great party.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Ohio's right in the middle there, Wes, so it's another reason to lobby for living in Ohio,
yeah, $30,000.
other than that
Yeah,
pesky winter thing, right?
dude, that's still nothing to sneeze at. I mean, $30,000 for and, if there is a day that you could shell out $30,000 for, I guess wedding would be one of those days, you know? But man, that's real money.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, so let me kick this off here if that's okay. I heard this great story from Jordan Peterson in his class Maps of Meaning, and you guys just bear with me, but it's a childhood story, and it talks about the dragon. And we've probably maybe all of us have heard of this story before, but it's interesting to hear the commentary that goes alongside of it. What's the deeper archetypal meaning behind these things? So it's the story of this little boy and his dragon, and the little boy is just a toddler, and he has this little sidekick dragon, and he's petting the dragon, and he says, "Mom, here's my dragon," and the mom says, "There's no such thing as dragons. Stop playing with the imaginary dragon." Then a couple years later, the dragon's a little bigger. And now the boy and the mom and the family are ignoring the dragon. And the little boy says, "Mom, the dragon's bigger." And the mom says, "Dragons don't exist. Ignore it." Well, fast forward a couple years later, now the dragon is on the dinner table, interrupting the dynamic of the dinner. And dinner, historically speaking, is supposed to be a cultural relevant, symbolic mechanism for families to share and exchange information, bond, and to grow. But they now have this dragon interrupting that process. And then you fast forward a little bit, and now the dragon has gotten so large where you can see the tail starting to peek out of the front door. So now the dragon is so large where now the community is starting to notice it. So not only the family, right, but now the community, but nobody's saying anything. Now everybody is practicing willful blindness. There's an obvious problem in the house and nobody's addressing it, and now that problem has seeped out to where the rest of the world knows about it. Anyway, fast forward another year or two, and now the dragon has gotten so big that it's wearing the house as a shell, kind of like a hermit crab sort of a deal. And it now has taken the house away, right? And the husband comes home and says, "Where's the house?" And not realizing that the problem that they've been ignoring this entire time through willful blindness has now gotten so large, it's taken away your house. And then the end of the story, and therefore the moral is finally the mother says, "Okay, the dragon is real." And as instantaneously as she says that, the dragon shrinks down to a level that is manageable. It doesn't disappear. It shrinks down to the level that it's manageable just by defining it, by acknowledging there is a problem. Right, which is really symbolic of like, hey, how many dragons do we have that we know we have to solve that because of uncomfortable conversation or decision making, we're not acknowledging it until it takes away the house. And then inevitably, we find out that when we just acknowledge it and articulate it, right, that it immediately removes stress and it shrinks it down to a level, right, that you can solve. So the reason I say this story because I thought it was really profound, and it's just an easy symbolic way of sort of memorizing, this pattern, which is when it comes to our finances and us being leaders of our family's finances, you have to be willing to step up and acknowledge the problems that exist. And by the way, the moral of that story is not that the problems go away. You actually don't want that as a human being. Like you were built by God, built by the universe, whatever you believe. You were built to fight against headwinds, and that makes you stronger. And not doing that, we all know that story. The person who has no problems, that's a terrible life. They got no strength because they have to fight against nothing. So the reason I bring this up is we're in really good times right now, economically speaking, market speaking, and so on. Bad times will come. To pretend that they are not going to come would be foolish as the mother in the story not acknowledging the dragon. So if your portfolios, if you're not following our advice of what we're saying, hey, make sure you have short-term capital, medium-term capital, long-term capital, short-term assets, medium-term assets, long-term assets, because the day will come when markets are not as great as they are now. And better to have that conversation now and make sure we're prepared for it. So I want everyone on this call and everybody listening to this on the recording thereafter, hey, check up on all of these accounts that we've been referencing for a long time now. Is each bucket filled up? And if it is not, then please, right, like call us, schedule a meeting, and we will address it. This has to be addressed now during good times. You do not build the storm shelter when the storm is occurring. You build the storm shelter when it's sunny.
Yeah, well, maybe to give you an example, and I hate to keep kind of beating this drum, but it's just it probably branded on my mind because of just family experiences over the past handful of years. But a problem that particularly the baby boomer generation has been told to solve, and it's just something that you want to push to the back burner because it's not that fun of a conversation, is long-term care, right? And this is one of those dragons that is absolutely growing, that if you don't do something about, right, it will inevitably overtake the house. And I saw it happen to my great aunt. Now, fortunately, she had the assets, right? But In Ohio dollars, we're talking about almost $100,000 a year for them to just basically be a glorified babysitter. I mean, they brought her meals and her medication, right? So it's one of those things. It's just maybe an obvious example, I should say, of hey, this dragon can grow out of control and be untamable if you don't get ahead of the problem or have some sort of solution prior to it happening. Right, and you still have the ability to solve it today, likely 2 decades before, that generation really starts hitting the wave of long-term care stays. But by time you show up to a long-term care facility, if your choice is to self-pay, to self-fund that stay, that's gonna be a pretty large dragon to slay. And ultimately, maybe you have the means to get through it, but you inevitably disinherit your children or the organizations that you care about because they don't get the legacy, since you had to hand it over to a long-term care facility. We know this as humans though, right? All problems are better off solved up front. The longer you wait, the more you procrastinate, the bigger the dragon becomes, and you just need that much larger and sharper of a sword to slay it, right? So that yeah, hate to kind of beat this drum, but Wes is right. Let's take care of these things when the economic skies are sunny and clear, right? Before the storm, before the day of reckoning, it is much more palatable to do it that way than to get caught swimming with your pants down and when the tide rolls out.
Yeah, well said. And to piggyback off of that, this is about appropriate, calibrated portfolio and money allocation. Because if you swing over to the other side, right, where it's like, "Oh my gosh, well, that's right, one day the sky will fall. Okay, so let me just, put all my acorns under the dirt here." That's a problem. And this next graph will show you, which I thought was really interesting, which is a graph of the American dream as depicted visually by the visual capitalist. Really fascinating. So they numerically documented the American dream here. I feel like David would really like this visualization here. The American dream per this data set cost $4.4 million today. And it's really interesting, right? They documented, okay, well, owning a car from payments from age 29 to 74, excluding fuel repair, $800,000. Dying apparently cost $8,453. So do not die because it's expensive. Getting married, roughly 40K. Buying a home, 30-year mortgage, 20% down payment, 930,000 for all of us living in California. We know that number is not real. And then retiring about 1.6 million for a retirement account. Californians, we also know that that's not sufficient as well. Raising 2 children, $830,000. Having pets, which is why I will not allow my girlfriend to get a pet, will cost about $37,000. And then taking vacations, no more vacations for Colin, because that's $180,000. Colin, what say you, buddy, on the cost of the American dream?
Yeah, that's pretty eye-opening numbers, right? I think probably the one that caught my eye is what it takes to retire. I bet you there's a lot of wiggle room in that number. Um, but man, I think the one thing that really catches my eye about that is the time horizon, right? That's a 20-year retirement. To go back to my great aunt, she was retired for 40 years. Right? I wish we all had a crystal ball and we could know when the kind of the finish line would hit us, because it would make that number a lot more obtainable and easy to kind of quantify. But wow, I mean, $4.4 million to live the quote unquote American dream. I know my dad has an interesting stat that is unrelated but fits in perfectly here, um, as to, like, how many folks have this type of net worth. That's pretty crazy, man. I mean, yeah, the cost of a home, the cost of children, the cost of pets, the cost of a retirement. It's a sobering way to show you that, like, hey, these things are not rights; they're privileges, and these privileges cost quite a bit of money. So to most of the folks on here, we could probably count our blessings having raised kids, owned homes. Some of us are already in retirement. Obviously, the transportation and the vacations that we've been on are already behind us. Pretty wild numbers to see them to see them spelled out like this.
Well, Joel, learning that right here, raising 2 children cost a hair over $800,000. Basically, Colin cost you almost a half a mil. Was it worth it?
I would really like to audit that in this particular situation. I feel extremely shortchanged. Um, where has
It's
all of this this is like we're gonna have to have the Department of Government Efficiency do an audit on this one in the Weimer household.
This is
so
why
Joel
I
basically
encouraged
saying you owe him
yeah.
money.
This is why I encouraged offloading that responsibility to Emma, his new wife. So, but Colin referenced an article that I read the other day. It's a Yahoo Finance article. In fact, we'll send it out to everybody on the call today. But the title of the article is, "Can you guess what percent of people have $4 million?" Here's a look at how many reach this major wealth milestone. The bottom line is that the number of families in America that amass $4 million of net worth is just a little over 3%. So if we're saying that the American dream costs $4 million over, I realize that's over the course of a lifetime, but if we're saying it now costs $4 million to live the American dream, people may believe that's attainable, but most people aren't reaching that level of wealth in their lifetime to live, quote unquote, the American dream.
Yeah, it's eye-opening, in my opinion. And this is where, again, where the leadership comes in. If we just pretend that that number doesn't exist and you actually cross-pollinate it with a very interesting concept. We spend a lot of time talking to people who are in let's say, the beginning stages of retirement, and they sort of intrinsically think that, okay, well, now the game is over, right? So we have to plan for short term. It's like, no, you have to plan for decades, right? So your age oftentimes is almost irrelevant. It's how many years do we have to plan for? The balance sheet doesn't care about your age. The balance sheet cares about whether or not you're taking out more from it than is sustainable. So, how many times, guys, have we talked to somebody in their, in their mid-50s and they think they're talking as if they're only gonna live another year and a half. And I would say this is more of the rule, not the exception. So they think of like, "Oh, well, basically now it's time to stop investing because I'm basically done." And it's like, no, to a large degree, you just started a new game, and that game can even be harder now because you've built an acceleration portfolio for decades. Well, now we didn't have to figure out how to land the plane over the course of decades as well. Colin, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I can tell you for sure in the Midwest. Midwest. I know that's a bit of a trigger word for you, Wes.
Yes.
Um, yeah. I know for sure in the Midwest though, particularly men think they're gonna die at like, 58 years old. And, I'll hear all of the time, our clients in their 60s say, "Oh, my parents, my dad, my uncles, etc." If I had a nickel every time my great aunt told me she was gonna die, right? Since I was 7 years old, she said that, "Hey, this will be the last Thanksgiving we spend together." She ended up living 25 more Thanksgivings, right? Now, yeah, not a joke, but, 25 more Thanksgivings. I understand not everyone's gonna live to 102 like my great aunt, but you better be darn sure that you're not gonna if you're going to plan on living until 85, right? Because again, your utility company or the grocery store does not care about your age when you show up to pay the bill. They want cash. And if your balance sheet can't provide that cash flow, right? If your assets aren't sustaining you on a consistent, predictable, and increasing basis into the future, we have a massive problem, right? Um, Again, fortunately, my great aunt had the assets, but she had one big asset that most of this generation, doesn't have, and that's a pension, right? So we really have to think, how do we recreate our own pension with our retirement accounts to ensure that hey, we're not going to run out of funds before we run out of days on the earth. And that is that is a pretty delicate dance when we're talking about a multi-person, multi-decade largely self-funded retirement. It's a large ask, and I don't think we shy away from that in our offices. You wanna work for 30 years and be retired for 30 years. That is not an easy task to accomplish. So we have to set sound barriers or sound parameters to the portfolio. And if we kind of stay within those parameters, stay within those barriers, we're in good shape, right? So we just want to make sure that those ratios are always healthy and that we understand what we're agreeing to up front. Because retirement is not a right? It is a privilege, and we have to make sure that again we navigate these uncharted waters without being irresponsible.
Yep.
David just made a really great comment. He said it's a huge mental shift going from accumulating money over the course of your working years to turning that switch off and then all of a sudden not saving money anymore, but accessing or drawing money out of those accounts. It's a massive emotional issue for people and they have a really, really hard time with it. And I think that's a very, very important point to make. And we're talking about today's dollars for all these things. I think it's real important that we start thinking about um, generationally here. Now, not only how do we provide for ourselves, but we start thinking if it costs $4 million to live the American dream today, think about what our children are the cost for our children with inflation pressures on those dollars into the future, what it's going to cost. We have to start thinking generationally as to how we plan, um, because it's not going to be much easier on children. It's going to be much harder.
Yeah, I mean, David Braun, if you're up for it, bud, we'd love to hear your personal perspective on that. Um, because as we know, like the psychology and the behavior behind all of these things, that's what matters. I would argue matters the most. So, David, maybe you could clarify or give some more detail on what that transition's been like for you.
Yeah, so it was like, you think about it, Colin, you mentioned 30-30. Really, it's more like 40-40, right? You start working at 20 or maybe before that, but it's 40 years of work and then 40 years of retirement. And there's some gray area there, how much you retire versus work in there. But um, so you think about it, 40 years of accumulating, saving, and then all of a sudden you have to switch to start deaccumulating, pulling money out. That was really hard for me. I'm getting more and more used to it, but it's really hard. And that's even if you've managed your own finances for a long time, you still need to have some financial planning people you can trust over that at least, the rest of your life, because you can't just say, okay, now I'm going to switch and start deaccumulating. You need people to help you stay accountable, to allocate money to the right places, to help you change your way of thinking.
And David, because I know you're so analytical and introspective, like walk us through maybe what are some of those thoughts? Is it like, hey, I feel like when I'm taking out a dollar, right, like I feel X or I feel Y. What are the feelings that come up for you?
The feeling is like, am I taking too much out? Am I hurting myself from my long term accumulation? Is the amount that I'm taking out now? I mean, what's going to happen? Like I'm 63, I just turned 63, but what's going to happen when I'm 83? Am I sacrificing stuff for those years? Will I have enough? Because at least now, I've got all my mental acuity, according to most people. But I've
Yeah, we'll
got
double
that.
check with Cheryl on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And we're doing some part-time work and stuff, but there's a time when we won't be able to. And I see it firsthand because I just spent a few days taking care of my 91-year-old mom while my sister was on vacation. Oh my gosh. If I'm like that at 91, it's just existing
Right.
and being able to pull down the money saved up. There is no opportunity at all for any generation of wealth at that time.
Yeah.
Those are the things that run through. It's like, am I taking out too much? And then what happens, what's on top of that is if there's a market downturn or something happens politically, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to recover from that anymore.
Yeah, no, it's very well said, and David, this is not to push our services on people, but it's like you need a coach, right? Like
Yeah.
coaches who have done this hundreds or thousands of times, because there was a great line. I forget where I heard this, but there is no problem that you cannot make worse. And usually that's from overreacting. So there's this great school of thought, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it talks about thought distortions and thought errors. And basically overreacting is one of those thought errors. You have a stimulus, you get so scared, your nervous system overreacts, and all of a sudden you just bulldoze the entire town, right? And you just made your problem so much worse.
Yeah.
So, completely versus when you have a team behind you saying, "Oh, no, this is normal. This is called markets." Like, that's why we planned for this, right? That's why we built in these other portfolios over here. So, okay, cool. You pause over here, you pivot over here. This is just normal. You're going through this for the first time. We've seen this hundreds of times. It's totally cool. And that can give you a
Yeah.
sense of, right, calmness. Yeah, Colin, what's your perspective?
Well, Wes, I think it's interesting because you and I had a private conversation a few weeks ago about some of the first advice that we give to other people that are starting a business or business owner clients or whatever it was. And one thing that you brought up that I thought was extremely helpful is like we actually do this as well. Like this is why our partnership exists, right? Because when you're high, I might be low, and you can kind of drag me out of the dumps, so to speak, right? So, whether it was with Dave, and certainly my dad and yourself, and like we also have developed a team and built the resources around us to make sure that we're not getting too out of control in one direction or the other, right? So this is not just a message that we preach to everyone on this call or all of our clients. This is medicine that we have to take ourselves, because I'd love to sit here and tell you that I am a robot and I'm just a bag of chemicals and I don't feel these emotions, but I don't love when I get my LPL statement and it is less than the month prior, right? I have the same emotions that all of you guys have. Um, it's just very, very helpful when you have a team around you to say that, yep, this is baked into the plan. This turbulence is expected. We knew before we ever left the runway that we might shake when we're 30,000 feet in the air. But what we want to avoid is making sure that the plane goes down entirely, right? We want to navigate the landing. We want it to be gentle. We want to ensure our safety upon arrival, right? And having a team in place and having coaches and having other people to hold you accountable is very, very helpful along that journey. Going at it solo, probably behavior is the number one way that you can blow up a retirement plan. Inserting bad behavior at the wrong time. The amount of people over the past 6 or 8 months that have asked what we should do because of the looming election, right? And then for the election to come, and not to get political here, but the market react so positively, right? The amount of people that wanted to pull their money from the stock market heading into this and miss what just happened over the last week is literally uncountable, right? And I think if you asked Wes and my dad, to count all of it up between our clients and people that we interacted with from classes or whatever else that we're involved in, they would have missed it if it were based on emotions or, some of the lack of the behavioral, the coaching or accountability. So those things are, yeah, I think is vitally important in what we're doing here, as much as anything, as much as the spreadsheets, as much of the crunching the numbers and the analytics, just ensuring that we behave appropriately and we set up a plan that we can actually fall asleep at night being comfortable with, knowing that we own it and we're going to be okay with what happens in the future, and we're not going to jump ship when the inevitable turbulence comes. That's probably as impactful of a part of this relationship as anything else.
Love it. Outstanding. Joel, any comments to add on top of that, buddy?
Well, I think it's really important. What we've been talking about is stress testing all the areas of a financial plan recently, and that's not just market. That's homeowners insurance, auto insurance, estate planning. Stress testing each of those areas and running them through scenarios where perfection doesn't happen, and how does that affect you And Dave made a great question or a great point again. How does that affect you not today or tomorrow or 5 years from now, but at 85 and 90 and 95? Because that's when the problems are going to show up. And that's when you have no ability to go back to work and fix those problems.
Absolutely outstanding. I want to switch gears here a little bit. I have a conversation actually quite frequently with clients, and it's regarding education expense because grandma and grandpa or mom and dad say, "Hey, I want to pay for college, higher education for my daughter or son or my grandson or granddaughter." And I really wanted to surface this conversation because it's very real. And it's almost fighting in biology because typically this is not a small expense and it could really devastate one's retirement portfolio. Um, and I think it's important to actually understand the investment that's being made. So I found this data, which I thought was really fascinating, so we can have this discussion. Um, that sounds so obvious, but it's so interesting how most people just don't dissect what a college degree, the return on a college degree actually is. You have to subdivide the data and you have to say, okay, well, what is little Johnny going to go to school for? Is that degree worth it? And again, not to be done at the school level, to be done at the degree level. And I just thought this information was fascinating. So if you are considering paying for a loved one's college education, you might want to consider looking at this data. You see things in like, okay, the return on investment is great for something like engineering or computer science, but when you go down below this line and you look at things like visual and performing arts, negative $100,000 return. Psychology, negative $16,000 return. Education, negative $20,000 return. Now, at least according to this chart on Visual Capitalist here, I am not saying like the moral of this story for me is actually do the research. I think college can be great. I also think it can not be so great. The numbers now are so serious where you actually have to do analysis on the degree and don't feel so much pressure because you have a granddaughter who really, 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 really wants to become a psychologist. You have to look at these numbers because I promise you, what most of our clients want is to not be a burden to their family in the future. But if you take out a chunk of $100,000 to help pay for college, right? That's $100,000 of opportunity cost of growth for the next 10, 15 years that you might be able to use for a long-term care situation. Or like David was saying, God forbid you are in a situation where you have to be able to pay expenses, right? But you can't earn money. You might need that $100,000 compounding at a certain growth rate for a decade to help you offset some of those expenses. Colin, what's your take on this data, bud?
Yeah, this is fantastic. Yeah, this is a great chart. I wish that that was like part of like applying for loans. Yeah, like somewhere in the enrollment process that that they'd show that. I wouldn't let any of that discourage me from getting a degree. I would, however, have it, I guess be put in the appropriate context of what I'm actually doing here. If when I talk to kids, and a lot of our clients have kids that are entering into college or will have kids that are going to college. I try to steer the conversation towards like, hey, your 20s are really about developing skills, and that can happen in a multitude of ways, in a multitude of arenas, right? It doesn't necessarily have to happen in the classroom. But the goal of college is not to get a degree. The goal is to develop skills that are valuable to a marketplace. And that simple shift in mindset really, yeah, for somebody like myself, for example, would have really helped going through the college process, for the one and only time that I went through it. Fortunately, I got a degree that was, relatively useful. But I could have definitely leveraged those 4 years better if I was less worried about passing to get a degree and more concerned with, hey, how do I develop skills that I can market to people and be useful in society, in the marketplace? And I think this does a decent job of, like, capturing the numerical value. Like, nothing against English majors, but the market is telling you they're not going to pay you very much. once you come out of school. So if you want to pursue that, I'm all for it. But what does that look like? And we can really do the thought exercise, with the student, whoever it might be, of saying like, hey, how are we going to turn this degree into something that's valuable in the marketplace, and not just fund a 4-year party for my, son or daughter or grandchild or whoever it's going to be.
So Joel, what I hear Colin saying is he's still not sure if his degree in interpretive dance was worth it or not. But Joel, what's your perspective on the cost of college education?
Yeah, so that was below the line definitely on that, on the payback, and it's so I think, Wes, you have a great approach to it, I think, is, looking at almost like analyzing a degree, a career as what particular skill. So let's go with the English major that Colin, mentioned earlier. So it's below the line. It's not one that you're gonna make a lot of money at, but can you look at that and can you say, "I'm gonna apply it in a particular way once I get out of school?" In other words, will I m maybe I could write advertising copy for financial advisors, right, in a way that gets them noticed and gets more people in their door. That becomes a very valuable skill, and you have to understand language in order to be able to do that. So if you're gonna approach it with a very analytical process like that and have a plan to use that degree, even though the degree itself may not be valuable, you may apply it in a way in future use that it can become above the line and actually be very valuable to you. So I think don't discount those, but actually think through how you're actually going to apply that after you get out of school. And most of the time, um, parents and students don't have that conversation. It's basically, well, I want to go there because my boyfriend or girlfriend is going there and I can't live without them. Or, oh, this seems like a really cool school. I'll have some fun. I'll get my degree, and that means I'll make $200,000 when I come out of college. There's no thought put into that, and the parents just rubber stamp that and go forward, and that's why we end up with whatever it is, $3 trillion of student loan debt that people are struggling to pay back, and because there's no analysis into what they're actually going to do with that degree once they get out of school.
Right. No, it makes total sense. Final piece here I want to show everybody is this really interesting piece again on the visual capitalist that talks about home price to income ratios. And the reason I want to bring this up is because, especially out here in California, there is a tendency for a certain portion of the population to say, well, I'm going to move out of California because the home prices are cheaper, the cost of living is cheaper, and so on, which is totally true. And this data shows that to be the case, which is the relative price relative to income ratios. And you can see they have a scale here, home price to income ratios ranging from 3 all the way up to 8, and California being 8.4. Hawaii being number one, 9.1 times. And West Virginia being all the way at the other opposite end of the scale, which is 2.9. So it's very, very fascinating. So basically, the way that they calculated this was dividing the median home price by the median annual household income in that particular state. How this relates to our investors is I want especially out here in California, just if you do that, be careful because anecdotally, when I've seen people move out of California, specifically Orange County, very rarely can they afford to come back. So if part of your retirement plan is to move away and your family's here and you just want to save some money, I can totally empathize and understand that. But just know the typical pattern that we see is 3 to 5 years later, they regret it because it's like, "Oh, what do you mean Texas is humid during the summer?" I didn't realize the winters are different in real life than they are on Hallmark movies out here in Pennsylvania. Um, and then they wanna come back into Southern California, and they say, "Oh, shoot, that same house, it's gonna cost me, 2.5 times more," or whatever the number is. So this data set kind of, like, solidifies that, just, kind of tells us what our intuition already is to be true. But Colin, what is your thought on that? Like, any commentary on the the cost of homes in particular relative, let's say, to the average annual household income across America?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. One thing I always find interesting is when you look at a pie chart of your net worth, how much of that is consumed by your primary residence.
Hmm.
And I think that is something that that number looks really nice on a net worth statement. But primary residence, in my opinion, outside of some pockets, like Southern California is probably one of the places to exclude this a little bit. But it's typically not a great asset in terms of investing. It's certainly not relative to its alternatives. And it's also typically, I know the last couple of years have been pretty crazy, but it's typically an illiquid asset, right? You can't just get your money out of your house overnight. You either have to sell it or you have to go get a home equity line of credit or something. And it's a process. There's a paperwork process. You might have to close on the house. You obviously have to move, right? Things of that nature. So I I always caution people to say like, "Hey, your net worth is one thing, but your liquid assets is another." And separating those numbers out, you'll typically find that, 20-25% of your net worth is tied up in your primary residence. And that's a pretty healthy slice of the pie there. We're talking one in every 4, one in every $5 of net worth is your primary residence. I don't think that chart had too many, you know, puzzling moments to it. I think we'd probably all kinda guess that houses in, the hot pockets of the country cost more in terms of, multiples of your income, your average income. It didn't surprise me that Ohio was pretty low on the list. Real estate in Ohio is relatively cheap, even though we like to complain about those big numbers. But yeah, I can't tell you how many people I've heard that story from, Wes. My mom's childhood friend wants to get out of California, but she knows it's an irreversible decision. The second that she leaves California, she cannot get back in terms of owning a home. And her entire network is out there, right? Her children are out there. Yeah, the community that she's built into for literal decades is out there, et cetera, et cetera. So that's hard, especially in those really, really hot markets in the country. If you wanna leave Austin, Texas right now, if you wanna leave Southern California, if you wanna leave New York, so on and so forth, it's typically a one-way decision unless you're talking about being an ultra high net worth individual.
Well, and in particular, the ratio is fascinating. So what that is saying, if I'm reading the data correctly, is in a place like California, and I believe this is probably gross numbers, not net,
Yep,
right?
probably.
The home cost 8.4 times, which is 8.4 years of the average annual household income,
Salary. Yeah.
right? Yeah. And that again, that's gross. If you actually did the net numbers, you're talking about many more years than 8.4. So in states like this, the narrative of, "Oh, well, little Timmy's gonna be able to graduate and within 2 years be able to put a down payment on his starter home." It's like out here in California, what's a starter home cost?
Yeah, $1,000,000. Yeah.
$800,000
Yeah.
minimum, it's pretty fascinating what's going on. Joel, what's your take?
Well, I agree. I think Kelly's brother, my wife's brother, exactly the same story. Would love to come back to Ohio and be around family. He hasn't been back here only 2 or 3 times in 40 plus years that he's been out there. But there's zero way that if he makes that decision and then doesn't is not happy with it, that he can go back to California. So, and again, grew up in the network. His son's friends are out there. Him and his wife's friends are out there. Very difficult decision to make. I think the harder decision to make, and I don't know if this is even possible, but analyzing that end game decision when you actually buy a house or settle down somewhere and taking that into the equation might be an answer to making it easier to be mobile when you actually retire and want to sell your house. So, but that's looking way down the tunnel and trying to figure out where and what housing prices will be 40 years into the future, which, yeah, as we know, is going to be pretty difficult to figure out.
Well, plus, out here, we're talking with clients quite frequently, if they have children and we say, "Hey, if you have excess capital," and we like the idea of investing in real estate, at a certain level of critical mass, well, hey, why not consider buying a property around here, renting it out until little Cindy and Timmy become, 26 years old, and then you can have them rented out, stays in the family. Because the probability of, if you have want any shot of your kids being local to you, and then therefore your grandkids likely local to you, you might have to consider, right, like investing alongside of them. In my opinion, not giving them money, right? Investing in an asset together that maybe they can pay into, on a fractional basis, et cetera. And then you get to keep the family, like the nucleus of the family, in a close, proximity. So just something to consider. Anyway, guys, let's do a final round discussion here. Colin, any final words of wisdom, or is everything that you said that it for today, bud?
Yeah, no, so I do wanna, thank John for once again submitting something this month. He sent us over a Wall Street Journal article on Warren Buffett and, Berkshire Hathaway kinda making headlines right now due to their cash position, right? And probably not a ton of new wisdom on this, but just to reinforce the fundamentals. And for, maybe for those that aren't familiar with the headlines that are going around, Berkshire Hathaway is a $1 trillion company, right? The trillion with a T. They have about 300 billion in cash right now, right? So that number, as that number grows, people in the retail space or in the institutional space start to speculate, hey, does Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, are they are they maybe insinuating that the next recession is right around the corner, and that's why they're beefing up their cash position, because there's going to be some stock market correction or collapse or whatever it is. The first thing I'd say to that was, like, again, they have $1 trillion of assets. So if 300 billion is in cash, the other 700 billion is invested, right? So there's definitely two sides to that paper. But the other point I would make on that, the game that Berkshire Hathaway is playing is much different than the game that you are playing for you and your family's personal retirement, right? They are not necessarily um, needing to define this by time horizons that have an end point, right? Their goal is to keep Berkshire Hathaway running for literal decades or centuries beyond Warren Buffett's life. Yours ultimately obviously ends. All of our lives end, right? So we do have an end point. We need to make sure we hit that finish line, right? So the way that we plan and the way that we move forward for our personal retirements is going to look a lot different than the way Warren Buffett behaves for Berkshire Hathaway. So it's an interesting article. I totally understand where it comes from. I don't see a lot of similarities or a lot of symmetric takeaways from the way that Buffett behaves for Berkshire and the way that you should behave for your personal retirement. But it's always interesting when Buffett makes a move, it's going to hit headlines, and that's what comes with being the greatest investor, probably to ever exist. Right? Not too many people have built $1 trillion companies off of capital management. I'd actually venture to say that nobody has. So it's pretty cool, when he's doing something, and the transparency that we get to it. It's just not very helpful for the conversations that we're going to move forward with to ensure that your family is taken care of in retirement. But John, thanks again. You've always been, you've always been, very interactive on this part, and hopefully, I don't think you're alone. I think many of our other clients and many of the other people on the call, probably see the same articles and hear the same sentiment of, hey, Buffett has a bunch of cash. Does that mean I should have a bunch of cash as well?
Right. And Colin, to piggyback off of that, it is similar in the sense that what we were talking about earlier, which is to have sub portfolios on your balance sheet, short term, medium term, and long term. So this would be like when they say Buffett's in cash, like I'm talking about actual cash. They're talking about short-term assets, something like treasuries, et cetera. Um, that is also what we're recommending for our clients. Like having, now we do it in a very specific way. It's a multiple of your expenses, but having that amount always stockpiled away for sure to hedge against recessions, et cetera. So it does not have to interrupt your lifestyle. The other component of that, and I think the article references this, and Colin and I talked about it, before we hopped on here, is Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway are playing a very different game, like Colin was saying. One of them being they will purchase entire companies, right? Like private businesses that cost a lot of money, right? We're not talking about $1 million business. You're talking about shelling out, being able to opportunistically buy an entire organization, right, when the price is right for them. So it's a bit different. Just be careful of like, hey, here's how it might be similar to your situation, but here's how it could be dramatically different. Joel, final words of wisdom, buddy.
I think what we're talking about, the bottom line here is protecting yourself in the event of some unforeseen circumstance that you have no control over. And one of the things I think we're going to try and do as we move forward is send out resources, articles, and different resources. I'd like to send out today after this would be, it's called 5 Ways Homeowners May Be Putting Their Wealth at Risk, and it talks about mistakes that you can make on property and casualty insurance when you're covering your home. And those things can put your actual other wealth at risk. So it's a short read, but it's a pretty good little synopsis of some things that we talk about to clients on a daily basis or every time we meet with them that I think will be valuable to you if you take a look at it. So we'll send that out in PDF form when we'll send out the recap.
Awesome. All right, guys, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days. If you need us in any way, please reach out and we'd be happy to serve you. Thank you, guys. Love you guys. Have a great day.